Loren Kohnfelder has over 20 years of experience in the security industry. At Microsoft, he was a key contributor to Stride, the industry's first formalized proactive security process methodology, and also program managed the .NET platform security effort. At Google, he worked as a software engineer on the security team and as a founding member of the privacy team. Loren joins us to talk about his new book, Designing Secure Software. We start the conversation geeking out a bit about his work to create Stride and digital certificates. We then discuss facets of the book like secure software, security design review, and what he would implement if he could only do one thing to improve software security. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Loren Kohnfelder.
You're about to listen to AppSec Podcast. When you're done with this, be sure to check out our other show, High Five.
Hey folks, welcome to this episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo, CEO of Security Journey and co-host of said podcast. I'm also joined by Robert Hurlbut. Hey Robert.
Hey Chris, Robert Hurlbut. Good to be here, threat modeling architect. Looking forward to our topic today.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this topic. I could literally almost fall over, but I'm going to try to stand up here but we'll get into why that is in just a second. But we are joined today by the author of Designing Secure Software from No Starch. And this is Loren Kohnfelder, who's joined us today. Loren, I've heard a lot about you over the years, and I'm so excited, and I'm sure Robert the same way. I'm so excited to get to finally talk to you and ask a whole bunch of different questions. So thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to talk about the book just out.
So for our listeners, we always start with our guest's security origin story. So we want to give you the opportunity to tell us, how did you get into this world of security? Okay.
Well, I've been programming for a long time, and I think what comes to me is the dawn of the security realization that led to the modern age is in the 90s. I was at Microsoft working on Internet Explorer. We're still back in version 3. And one day we got told, we have to talk to this journalist, and a bunch of us were sitting around in the conference room on a big speakerphone call. And we found out that Internet security was now a thing. Right. And Explorer had been developed for years. Nobody thought about what could possibly go wrong. And, to be honest, in hindsight, it was absolutely full of holes. We didn't even have anybody particularly looking at security. And I think, as is well known, there was a series of releases of whacking of gophers popping out of new holes. And really, the challenge is still with us, although we've learned a lot in the process. So it's interesting to me to think how naive everybody was. We'd had the Morris worm in the late 80s, but still, when Microsoft was pushing the internet, nobody realized this was a problem, and we had to start getting serious.
So you were at Microsoft, or you left Microsoft before the Gates memo, though, right? So you were there in kind of the lead up to it, or?
I think I was there a few months after that memo, and then did leave afterwards. I was working on .NET, and I was the security program manager for it. And we were, I stayed there through shipping 1.0, and it seemed like it was time for me to take a break at that point, shall we say.
Yeah, Robert's a big .NET aficionado, and we had Steve Lipner on in a previous episode of the podcast where we did kind of a history of SDL at Microsoft. Mm-hmm. So I asked him a bunch of questions about the memo just because I was watching it as an outsider looking in. But that's cool to hear that you were part of that early Internet Explorer team and got to see kind of the foundations of security coming together at Microsoft.
Okay, good. Those early days led us to a realization that we had to get systematic about this after we had a little bit of a handle on Internet Explorer. And of course, that led to a bunch of innovation that was kind of a grassroots effort. I think Steve and a number of people kind of pulled everyone together and said, we got to figure this out.
Also, Loren, your name especially for us in the threat modeling circles, is fairly well known in terms of Stride and being associated with Stride. Tell us about that, the origin of Stride.
Yes. Thank you for asking. And that's something else, again, nobody could have possibly foreseen, that would be anything we're still talking about here. But as I said, a group of people came together, and one of the things that we did was there was a company magazine, I think it was called Interface. And so I teamed up with Prerit Garg, and we signed up to write an article to try to tell people how to think about security and proactively, right, begin to understand what you might need to do in their products. And as a result of that, we got into threat modeling. I think, as I recall, he was much more knowledgeable about it from an academic background. And we learned about it, and then we were working on a taxonomy of what sorts of things do we need people to think about. And we, whiteboarded on that for a while. And as I recall, I was in my office thinking, well, gee, people are going to have to think about these things every time they do threat modeling. We're going to have all kinds of people all over Microsoft. That was our scope at the time, right? And so maybe we could do a mnemonic to make this easy to remember. And so I just fiddled around with the words a little bit, and Stride popped out. And we put that in the magazine article, and it seems to have stuck. But as you well understand, it's not the end all of threat modeling. It's just one little aid, and it's a quick, I don't want to say a gimmick, but it's a quick way to get some basics down. And I think interesting things to think about are, what do we need to extend to Stride in various contexts? What about privacy, et cetera, right? Those things were way ahead of us at the time. And I don't mean to say we need to get a new acronym, but certainly it does need to evolve, and it's not the end of the work that's necessary.
Yeah, and now we have Linden, which took some of its inspiration from Stride, focused on the privacy side. And so, so when I think about Stride, though, it's funny. I have what I'd like to describe as a love-hate relationship with Stride.
Okay.
So when I first started at Cisco, learning about threat modeling and trying to figure out how to roll it out to lots of different people and lots of different engineers, I was like, oh, this Stride thing, it's great. It's simple. It gives us a mnemonic and easy way to teach people that don't know a lot about security, the things they can just think about. They're not just, because I saw that same thing I'm sure you saw when you created it, and that people would be sitting there going, okay, threat modeling. What do you want me to do? What should I think about? And so I went and I was using it like crazy. I was teaching it, and guess what? Then I got too cocky. I was like, this Stride thing is just too easy. It's too simple. I'm not going to teach this anymore. And then after about a few months, I made my way back to Stride, because I was like, you know what? There's really not any better way that I can find to teach the basics of this. And I always tell people, like, this is something we want you to graduate from very quickly. Like, you can certainly use it as a reference, but if you're still threat modeling 5 years from now and only considering Stride, like, you haven't gone where we want you to go. But once again, I'm back to loving Stride, and I have for the last number of years. There was only a short period of time where I didn't, because I got too cocky about, that it was too easy. But so, yeah, I mean, it's something that, it's funny. I use Stride at least once a week, like talking about threat modeling or teaching and doing things like that. Like, it's always something that it's just my go-to, and so it's amazing that something that you created, 2 decades ago now, is still floating around, and you'll find it in every threat modeling book, mentioned in every threat modeling webinar. Now, Loren, here's an idea. What if you got $1 for every time somebody said Stride? Let's see if we can. I'll see if we can work on that deal somewhere. But I wanted to come back around to the book here. And as I was taking a look at the book, and I was looking right at the one of the quotes that was, I think it was either on the front or the back, on the back jacket of it. And I'm going to read the quote just so our audience has a perspective on what it was. But I was like, wait a minute. This is the guy that wrote this book that I'm talking to here. As the inventor of digital certificates, Loren has already made extremely important contributions to information security. He continues that path in this book. That's Martin Hellman, professor at Stanford University. So I was like, wait a minute. Loren created the digital certificate. Like, this is a story I must know. So please tell me more about, or tell us more about this idea of how digital certificates came into being.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, I was at MIT as an undergrad, and for the Bachelor of Science degree, you're supposed to write a thesis paper. It's something like a light version, I think, of a master's paper. And I was in the computing lab, and because that's where they had terminals, right? That's how we used computers back then. Terminals to a Multic system, I think it was. And right on the hall there was the offices of Ron Rivest and Len Adelman, who I think I just found out, had published this paper on RSA. And actually, I somehow got the paper, I think, out of a library and read it. And as it turns out, the original paper had kind of a clunky part of it, which was called the reblocking problem. It's a little bit of a technical nuance, but you're doing prime numbers multiplication, and then your modulo, the composite product of the two primes, right? And the thing is, when you're doing a two-way conversation, right, your composite number that we're modulo and my composite number that we're modulo are different. And stop me if I'm too much in the mathematical weeds here, but it's how I got to know those guys. So if your modulo is a little bigger, you might produce a number that doesn't fit in my modulo, right? Because it's a little bit bigger. So therefore, they had this clunky, well, then you have to break the message in two and blah, blah, blah. So I got up a little gumption after doing a little bit of writing on a piece of paper, and I walked into Ron Rivest's office and said, just reverse the order of your operations and it'll work, right? And so they said, you're right, quite quickly, actually. And so then they kind of took me under their wing. I ended up doing this thesis with Len Adelman, and who's A, right, of RSA. And they were saying, so we've got this, public keys are great. You can tell your public key to the world. And everybody was thinking, like, we'll publish a phone book of all the public keys. And we were only thinking really military and banking at that point, right? No idea that it would be as easy as what we're doing right now. And so they said, we'll publish these phone books and everybody will do that. And it was like, well, but they have to type in the long numbers, and that's kind of clunky. And how do you know it's an authentic phone book? So Len suggested I look at the practical applications of crypto based on RSA. So, long story short, I came around to, well, it's got signatures, so we can have people sign statements about their keys and their identities. And then if you have a certificate authority who everybody trusts, who collects those, that's all you need. You just need one root key to get started, and the rest happens. So I wrote that up in my paper. I think I got an award and, $100 or something, and got invited to a party. Nobody thought about copywriting it, or I shouldn't say copyright, I should say patenting, of course, which, might have been a whole nother world, but that was it. That was my contribution. I'm glad that people are using it. I don't need $1 for every time that's used either, of course.
Yeah. So, you think about where certificates are used, though.
Yeah.
Like this idea that came out of your brain is like on every personal computer, there's how many hundreds of certificates and CAs and all the browsers and everything. It's just fascinating. Like, you're somebody we can look at you and say, you're one of the foundational blocks of the security of the internet.
Yeah,
is your contribution there. That's incredible.
Yeah, I've been in the right place around. Actually, before, when I was at Berkeley, before I transferred to MIT, I knew Ralph Merkel, and he introduced me to Marty Hillman, because they were doing a lot of foundational stuff. They had like a knapsack. There was an early public key algorithm, et cetera. So I got to know Marty Hillman through that. And then when I wrote the book, I mentioned key exchange in it. And I just used Diffie-Hellman as something that the math is relatively straightforward, and let him know. And he wrote back and said, here's a quote, feel free to use it. So I slipped it on the back of the book at the last review before they finalized it. And that's That's how you found out about that. And I, of course, do talk about the certs and that stuff in the book as well.
So, Loren, in your mind, what is secure software? I know that's what the book is about, but what does that mean to you?
Yes. Well, I like the question, the way you phrased it, because it is in my mind. It's not something that exists in the real world, secure software, I think, as a goal, obviously not counting something trivial. And I mostly on the first cut at that, I would say it's software that is not insecure, in the sense that all of the ways that we know of and have chronicled, and a lot of those are listed in the book, that we know of, people have thought about and avoided them or mitigated them sufficiently, right? So a little bit you can think, I think, as an analogy as food safety, right? Healthy food is something that's been prepared properly, it's had proper storage, there's a whole chain of custody. You didn't poison it with a contaminant, you didn't let bacteria get, et cetera, right? It's not something you ever perfect, right? It's more complicated than that. So, at the first cut, it's like you haven't done all these things wrong that we know happen, and people can get it wrong. But then I kind of flip that back around and see that security measures can often get in the way, or they can complicate it, or they can make the user experience miserable. And so a lot of, the reason for the focus on design, and part of why, I'm pushing move left, is if you anticipate security problems, sometimes you can design right around those things, right? Rather than going in one direction and then having to do a bunch of security slapped on at the end. So this kind of proactive, it's a deft move, right? It's hard to do. If you set up your authorization and your authentication just right, it's really easy to use and it works smoothly and it can be extended nicely. So it can also contribute a lot. And I think security problems are, at the root of a lot of the problems on the web, right? We can't just trust the whole internet to always be truthful and good and all that stuff, right? And identify themselves correctly. So therefore, we have to layer on all kinds of mechanisms. And often that makes it clunky and has terrible side effects. So
as I was reading through the book and looking at the chapter on security design review, I know you spent a good number of pages kind of going through that and talking about the steps in the process and everything. It made me think about, from your perspective, what's the difference then between a security design review and a threat model?
Okay, good question. The security design review, I should explain, I think is one of the unique things in the book that I couldn't find a lot written about it anywhere. And I think I should explain precisely what it is to answer your question. So when there's a design that's fully formed, maybe just short of final, it's great to review it, right? And so the security design review happens at a particular point in the design of a piece of software or of an iteration. Threat modeling is a tool that you use in security design and in the review, but it can be used for all kinds of things, and it should be used throughout the life cycle and many different places in the process. To expand on that, in the book, I know there's a lot of great methodologies that have been developed subsequent to our early stuff at Microsoft. And I think those are great, and people for various reasons are going to use different ones, but I didn't want to get into that. I wanted to stay very broad and general and work on the concept. So I used Adam Shostack's 4 questions as my grounding and kind of a first principles approach. And then what I want to do is show how you use threat modeling to explore the space of possibilities in design, to see the impact of your requirements, all these things like that. And then at the design review, you've got this design which is written down and you're at a fixed point in the cycle. So you can say, okay, now I can see it, it's in black and white, and now let's make sure that they've got it right. And then threat modeling is really your main tool to look at it at that point. And then when it passes the review and necessary changes get made, then you move on. But again, implementers are going to do threat modeling in their choices of various aspects of the architecture and the implementation and libraries they use, et cetera. SecOps people are going to use threat modeling. In the book, I even described you could use threat modeling. We used it to child-proof our room when we had a visitor with small children. You know, what are we here for, right? What could go wrong, right? Did we take care of it? How did we do, right? So
good old retrospective at the end of that.
Yeah.
Did we do a good enough job
yes.
to deal with this?
Absolutely.
Stuff? So, one of the things you said about the security design review in regards to SecOps or DevSecOps just made me think about what's your recommendation for folks? I mean, everybody's moving towards a DevOps world, or some people are even in a DevOps world. Some people think they're in a DevOps world. They probably never will be, but we're in different stages of adopting DevOps. And when I think about a security design review, it seems like a more heavy thing. And when I think DevOps, I think speed. I think, hey, I'm pushing 50 times a day. Like, what are your thoughts on the how DevOps and security design reviews kind of meet in the middle, and security design review doesn't slow everything down to the point where nobody wants to do it because they're like, hey, we got to go fast, and you're making us go slow.
Okay. Excellent question. And let me say that operations, in a sense, is outside of my main experience. And in the book, I don't go into a lot of operation things, but I do talk about it just to make sure that implementers are putting the product on a path so that the operations people will be able to do their thing correctly, right? They shouldn't, ship the product out and like, I have no idea what happens to it from there, right? You need to have some awareness of what's coming, but the actual decision. But to get back to your question, I was doing design reviews in a environment, and this is, I've been doing them for 20 years, right? And in that environment, like a new product or a big version change would get a design review. And other than that, people were just doing incremental stuff, and it didn't get a lot of attention, which is unfortunate, right? That's holes for it to drop through. And obviously I would like it to be more granular and get reviews plugged in there along the way. However, even if you're in an environment where stuff is pushing out very rapidly, I think then the design review really shrinks to fit the pace, right? And let me say, even like at Google, I was doing, large systems, big storage systems. I did maps once. Think about Google. This is an older version of maps, but it has a lot of stuff in it. And I did not, look at the whole thing. The design documents I had were pretty high level, but still, I think it was a valuable exercise. So it's just a tiny fraction of the work that goes into the design and architecture. It's really just bouncing it off somebody who's got the security mindset, thinking in that direction, asking you some questions to make sure you're not missing something. And as I said, it is on a written document or a facsimile thereof at a certain point in time. So I was able to reduce it to 6 steps and say, here's a little process for you. And it's a nice little gate. But those could be, you send me a delta and I look at the red lines, I just run it through my security mindset and I say, looks good to me, right? You could reduce it that much if you need to move fast.
You've worked a lot of interesting places too, Loren, by the way.
Yes.
You're just like, oh yeah, at Google, we did a design review of Google Maps,
yeah,
Microsoft. Yeah. So I'm once again, I'm just taking it all in. Oh yeah, at RS or at MIT, where I was hanging out with RSNA. Yeah, just kind of hanging out with those guys.
Yeah, I never met Adi Shamir, but like someday we can talk about when I worked in Japan, 2 different stints. But
yeah, we're gonna have to. We're gonna have to do that another time. We're gonna have to get back to the book. I know, Robert, you had a question about implementation items.
Yeah, you mentioned about implementing different items, but if at all possible, if you could narrow it down to one that you would say, this is what you must do, what is that and why?
Yes. Generally, those questions, when I hear them in an interview, I think, oh boy, how could you possibly, what's your favorite movie or whatever. But for this one, actually, I have an idea, which is input validation, right? Or the flip side, untrusted inputs, if you want to look at what's the problem. just because that's so pervasive, right? Inputs, everything has inputs, right? Unless it's doing some sort of static calculation. And whenever you have an input that is not what you expect it to be, right, there's a chance that your code isn't going to, I think probably everybody knows this, but not only do inputs insert problematic cases into code, but the other thing is that often attackers can drive them and they can control the inputs and do what they want. Now, of course, you can say, well, my code anticipates all possible sizes and formats and everything, right? And then you've got a huge testing matrix ahead of you. And probably, if you don't set a gigabyte limit on the input, probably you're going to blow up and have a denial of service problem, right? So it's just not a problem. You can say, we're going to write a little framework and then we're done. Okay. So yeah, I wrote a lot about it. I've got a number of examples, and I think it's a super important topic that everybody needs to really get square in their mind, because we deal with stuff like that every day. It's an input, or it's indirectly an input from somewhere else being passed to you, right? And you don't know if you can trust what's coming, and if they always sent you JPEGs, but then tomorrow they start sending you PNGs, are you ready for that, right? It's a really hard problem, because those interfaces is exactly where, right, systems and components and developers point fingers at each other and say, I thought you were responsible for making sure that was reliable or whatever, right? So I think that's a huge area. And
so as we're coming towards the kind of the conclusion of our interview,
okay,
from your perspective as the author, why should our listeners go get this book right now? Like, what's your pitch for them as far as why they should go get it?
I thought a lot about that in the process of writing. And one thing that writing the book did, just to set this up a little bit, is at first I thought a book like this must exist. Fairly short, gives you a broad overview of the field, because we want to get a lot of people connected to software, working on it, not just developers, but all the people around them, user interface, managers. We want them to have some intuition about what these problems are and how we have to deal with them and what they mean in the long run to the product. So I wanted to write a really approachable book. And in the process, I found it's really hard to write that book, because you want to stay very general. You don't want to go too geeky. On the other hand, programmers like to have code in the book. And so I've got part 3 has code in the implementation section. And so I was just balancing all those things in the process. So there are 2 points that I just drive into the book as hard as I could. And I had the editor, checking me to make sure it wasn't going to absolutely be too much. One is, let's get more people to better understand security. And whether that's somebody who's new to it or has been daunted by it, get your toes wet. This will get you started. You can learn a lot. Maybe it's somebody who knows something about security. They're not real confident. This can fill in gaps. Maybe you just read certain chapters, and others you go, okay, yeah, I get that. And then I think even for security professionals who really know this stuff and live and breathe it, I think the way we talk about security and the way we interact with the people who aren't like that is really important. So I've tried to not just bridge that gap, but also help people understand ways I've found that we're successful at talking to people about security. Not be absolutist, be flexible, embrace any little change you can get. So for all those reasons, right, I think the industry clearly, we need to do something better. And more knowledge, more people involved earlier, all that is good. That's what's behind the book.
Yeah, we definitely agree with you on that. Like, we want to see more people get into application security, software security. We want to see more people coming out of university systems that have the knowledge that's in this book. And so that's what's going to get us all to that future where we imagine SQL injection doesn't exist anymore, things like that.
Yes.
Like buffer overflows are a thing of the past. Like we're all aiming in that direction. And yeah, I think this book is going to help to get that knowledge base out there for people to be able to understand it. So, normally we would ask you for key takeaways and a call to action, but I'm going to ask you for something else as far as like, what what options do our listeners have to get the book right now, and what are you and No Starch able to offer to our listeners right now to get the book in their hands?
Okay, thank you, Chris. You may be reading in the newspaper about supply chain issues, and I don't know what that is, but the book was originally supposed to come out in October, and then it got pushed to January, and then they pulled it back. So the printing industry, the book distribution industry right now is really struggling. And of course, I'm going up against, Stephen King and all the bestsellers coming out at this time of year as well. So No Starch has made heroic efforts to get this book printed as soon as they have. And what they did is they have the first copies of the book right now. They're shipping as of, I think, a week ago. And for this podcast, they set up a discount code that people can use, which is security25. That's all uppercase if it matters. There's an input validation issue for you. And that will get you 25% off. I'm not sure if it's just my book. I'm guessing it's just my book, but who knows? Then in addition to that, I will, somebody pointed out to me, No Starch is selling the ebook now. And someone said it's a little more expensive. And the reason that is because it's without DRM. So they just send you a PDF and a Mobi and a EPUB, I think. And they trust you to do the right thing with those. So those are available now. And I do believe if you buy it other places, it'll be locked into whatever your book reader is. So you do have that choice. Also with No Starch. December is the big release when it would be available from all kinds of booksellers.
Very cool. Well, Loren, thank you for, first of all, writing the book. I enjoyed reading it and, learned a few things along the way, and wrote some questions based on some of the things that I saw in the book here.
Good.
As well. But thank you for sharing some of your stories with us. And you are one of the most interesting people in security that I can say that I've met. I didn't know most of the stories you told her. I was like, oh, I didn't even know that. I just was asking a question. So thanks for sharing your expertise. Thanks for writing the book. And we want to encourage our listeners to, use that discount code Security25, buy a copy of this book, buy a couple of copies. And here's my challenge now. I'm going to throw it to here's my call to action for the listeners. I don't usually get to do this. So buy a copy for yourself and buy a couple of copies for the computer science students in your life. Let's put this in the hands of some of the computer science students out there, because to Loren's point earlier, that's how we're going to change the world here, is by the next generation of developers getting this knowledge into their hands. And so that's my challenge. Buy one for yourself, buy a couple for some CS students. If you don't know any, I don't know, go to the local college and hand them out to people. Say, do you work with computers? Here, you need to learn this. Loren, once again, thanks for writing the book. Thanks for being a part of the show. We look forward to a future episode where we learn about your life in Japan and the 25 other interesting stories I know that you have that I have to find a way to extract from your memory. So once again, thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Application Security Podcast. You'll find the show on Twitter at AppSecPodcast and on the web at www.securityjourney.com/resources/podcast. You can also find Chris on Twitter at EdgeRoute and Robert at Robert Hurlbut. Remember, with application security, there are many paths, but only one destination.